Aston Martin's 2026 car was so bad it was physically injuring its drivers. But the same weakness that made Alonso go numb mid-race may have given Honda the one thing every manufacturer is desperately searching for under these new regulations, and the rest of the grid might not realize it until it's too late. Then Miami happened, and suddenly the whole mood changed. Both Aston Martins finished the sprint and the Grand Prix without major mechanical disasters, no sudden shutdowns, no embarrassing retirements halfway through the race. But the real shock came after the weekend. Honda's lead trackside engineer Orihara did not focus on raw speed or extra horsepower when talking about the next steps. Instead, he pointed directly at energy management and drivability as the key targets moving forward. That wording matters way more than people realize. In Formula One, teams almost never openly talk about their real weakness unless they already believe the previous disaster has been handled behind the scenes. Reliability was clearly the first emergency mission, and now it looks like they think that problem is finally under control. What comes next could completely change Aston Martin's future. Because if Honda discovered something valuable during those ugly opening races, something Ferrari, Mercedes, and even Red Bull still have not unlocked, then this could become bigger than any aero package or engine upgrade on the grid. And the wild part is that the rest of Formula One may have accidentally helped Honda reach that breakthrough faster. The vibration nightmare was the biggest headline for a reason. Alonso reportedly lost feeling in his hands and feet after just 30 laps, while violent oscillations were damaging battery components inside the car. One Aston Martin chassis was even left behind in Japan for urgent investigation, while every other team moved on to the next race weekend. The situation looked chaotic. By every possible standard, Aston Martin was dealing with a full-blown crisis. But there was one massive detail almost nobody talked about while all the chaos was happening. The AMR26's huge weakness in high-speed corners, where reports claimed it was losing up to 12 miles per hour against rival teams in certain sections, may have secretly created an unexpected advantage. Normally, when a Formula One car attacks fast corners at maximum speed, the driver depends heavily on electrical deployment to keep the car balanced on corner exits and maintain momentum down the straights. That burns through harvested energy incredibly fast. Batteries drain quicker, temperatures spike, and the brutal cliff edge behavior teams have struggled with in 2026 becomes even harder to manage. But Aston Martin's situation was different. The AMR26 simply could not push those corners aggressively because the chassis was too unstable. Drivers had to enter slower and exit with less force just to keep the car under control. On paper, that sounds terrible, and for performance, it absolutely was. But under these new hybrid regulations, it also meant something strange was happening in the background. The battery state stayed far more stable across an entire lap. Before we get into this deeper, if you're finding this breakdown useful, drop a like and subscribe. While Ferrari, Mercedes and Red Bull were fighting non-stop to balance deployment, overheating and battery usage right at the edge of performance, Honda suddenly had access to something extremely valuable, cleaner and simpler data. With fewer aggressive variables shaking the system apart, engineers could spot weaknesses faster, understand battery behavior more clearly, and isolate problems without the usual chaos other teams were battling through. That is not some small silver lining. From an engineering standpoint, that can become a serious development edge. And after Miami, Orihara never mentioned chasing raw lap time or catching the front runners. He specifically pointed at energy management and drivability as the next targets moving forward, and that statement says a lot more than people think. This was Honda's lead trackside engineer speaking right after the first race weekend, where both Aston Martins finally crossed the finish line without total mechanical chaos. Most teams would have spent the whole weekend celebrating survival after such a rough start to the season. Orihara did not react that way at all. Instead, he immediately shifted focus toward the next issue: and that tells you something huge behind the scenes. To him, the reliability disaster already looked finished. Not temporarily controlled, not barely hanging together, but actually solved. That mindset matters because Formula One engineers do not casually move on from a major crisis unless they truly believe the foundation problem is gone. The decision to prioritize energy management next is a massive clue about what Honda now understands regarding the 2026 regulations. Energy management is not some easy adjustment teams can casually tweak over a race weekend. To even begin optimizing it properly, you need stable, repeatable, and extremely clean data from the car. Without that, the entire system becomes a guessing game. And that was Honda's nightmare during the opening races. The violent vibrations were not only hurting the drivers physically, they were also wrecking the telemetry coming from the car. Sensors were struggling to provide accurate readings because the oscillations were shaking everything apart. That created distorted data, and distorted data completely destroys deployment calibration. Once the calibration becomes unreliable, predictive energy mapping falls apart too. Honda could not properly build simulation models because the information feeding those systems was inconsistent and messy. But Miami appears to have changed everything. That level of understanding cannot simply be bought with money or copied from another team's blueprint. In Formula One, manufacturers have to suffer through real track conditions to truly learn how these systems behave. Aston Martin's brutal 2026 struggles may have been the painful price Honda needed to pay to gain that knowledge. And right when Honda needed help the most, the rules shifted in a very interesting way. The rules gave Honda 230 extra dyno hours and $11 million in budget flexibility. The official reason? F1 doesn't want a manufacturer stuck at the back permanently. But the practical result? Honda just got handed a development accelerator right when they solved their biggest problem. So yes, helping Honda recover is absolutely in Formula One's best interest. But here is where things get really interesting. Honda has a long history of turning humiliation into motivation. During the disastrous McLaren partnership years, they became the punchline of the paddock. Fernando Alonso famously called their engine a GP2 engine over team radio, creating one of the most talked about and embarrassing moments in modern Formula One history. Honda got dragged non-stop after that. They eventually stepped away from the sport, rebuilt behind the scenes, returned stronger, and then produced power units that helped drive Max Verstappen and Red Bull to 4 straight world championships. That kind of comeback is not accidental. Once Honda identifies the real source of a performance problem, they attack it with relentless development speed. Their philosophy is not based on slow and cautious refinement. They push through endless cycles of testing, revision, and aggressive iteration until the weakness is gone completely. Give Honda an extra 230 dyno development hours, another $11 million in budget flexibility, and a car that is finally producing cleaner data from a more controlled operating window, and suddenly the entire situation starts looking dangerous for the rest of the grid. Aston Martin's messy start may have accidentally created the perfect testing ground for Honda to speed up development much faster than expected. And the wild part is that the teams who approved the ADU rule revisions may have unknowingly helped make that possible. Those extra resources are not small advantages. In Formula One, additional testing time and engineering freedom can completely change the speed of a recovery project. If Honda already solved the reliability crisis, this could push them toward real competitiveness shockingly fast. Red Bull already proved what Honda can become when given the right structure around them. People forget how bad things looked during the McLaren years before Honda rebuilt itself into a championship-winning force. Now Aston Martin is inheriting that rebuilt Honda foundation, and this time Adrian Newey is inside the project too. That changes everything long-term. Not instantly, of course. The AMR 26 was already far into development before Newey arrived, And even he has openly admitted this is not truly his car yet. His fingerprints will be much more visible starting in 2027 and beyond. But that timing actually lines up perfectly with Honda's bigger plan. By the time Newey begins fully designing around the Honda power unit, Honda will already have an entire season of real-world race data collected under these new regulations. And not just random data, valuable data gathered from a simplified operating environment where engineers could isolate problems and study the hybrid system properly. That matters because some things simply cannot be fully understood inside a wind tunnel or on a dyno bench. Honda will learn how the energy system reacts under real racing pressure, how deployment behaves over long stints, how harvesting calibration changes from track to track, and how the chassis and power unit interact under actual race conditions. And that last part is the biggest detail of all: integration. Customer engine deals always limit how deeply teams can connect the chassis and power unit departments. Ferrari and Mercedes both supply engines to multiple teams, which forces them to make broader design choices that can work across different cars. That naturally creates compromises, but Aston Martin and Honda are building towards something much tighter and more aggressive. A fully integrated package designed around one vision, one chassis philosophy, and one power unit direction. And if Newey and Honda get that combination right, the rest of Formula One could have a serious problem on its hands. Honda and Aston Martin do not have the same limitations that customer teams deal with. They are building one complete ecosystem together, one chassis, one power unit, one shared development target, all moving in the same direction. That kind of factory-level integration can become incredibly powerful under these regulations. And this is exactly the type of setup Adrian Newey has always loved working with. Throughout his career, Newey has been obsessed with tight rear-end packaging, airflow stability, and designing cars where the chassis and power unit operate almost like a single machine. Now picture him eventually building a car around a Honda engine whose energy behavior has already been deeply studied through months of painful real-world testing. Add in 230 extra dyno development hours and $11 million in additional budget flexibility, and suddenly this project starts looking very serious. Formula One has already seen this combination work before. In fact, it created one of the most dominant stretches of the modern era. Red Bull and Honda built a partnership that delivered 4 straight world championships, turning Honda from a team everyone mocked into the foundation of a title-winning empire. Now comes the uncomfortable twist for the rest of the grid. Red Bull spent years helping Honda evolve into a championship-level engine manufacturer, and then the partnership ended. Honda moved to Aston Martin, Newey followed later, and suddenly the pieces started falling into place again. With full factory integration, major regulatory support, extra dyno time, and one of the greatest designers in Formula One history now inside the project, Aston Martin is quietly building something that looks very similar to the structure that made Red Bull almost impossible to beat between 2021 and 2024. Aston Martin started 2026 as the punchline of the paddock. Their car was hurting drivers, failing batteries, and bleeding data. But every single one of those disasters was feeding Honda exactly what they needed: real-world understanding of the 2026 energy regulations that no wind tunnel or dyno can replicate. Add Newey in 2027, extra development resources, and a manufacturer with a proven track record of turning humiliation into dominance. And the question isn't whether Aston Martin will recover. It's whether the rest of the grid realizes what's already happening. And don't forget to like and subscribe to never miss the latest F1 news.